Hello, my name is Eric Patterson, and I serve as Executive Vice President of the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. This is RFI's 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series. At RFI, our mission is to secure religious freedom for everyone, everywhere around the world. The purpose of the 3 Questions on Ukraine interview series is to highlight the religious dimensions and the religious freedom implications of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. My guest today is Mr. John Smith. John Smith has served Ukraine and the Ukrainian people in a variety of ways over the year. His family roots in Ukraine with grandparents who immigrated to the United States. He has served in the American Army Reserve Forces training Ukrainian troops. He served as an election observer, as a humanitarian, as a missionary, and as a friend to the Ukrainian people. And so with that background, we're delighted to have Mr. Smith with us today for this interview. John, welcome.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for the mission of RFI, and thanks for the chance to speak with you about this topic.
You're welcome. Well, tell us, why is the defense of Ukraine so important for people who care about religious freedom?
Yes, why we should care is a great place to start our conversation. Ukraine is, in my view, the world's best hope that a large, formerly communist nation can transform from repression to freedom, especially religious freedom. And that hope only survives if Ukraine is victorious in its current fight. Through my entire adult life, I have been an eyewitness to the glorious transformation towards religious freedom that Ukraine has been struggling to make. And Russia's invasion and occupation threatens to undo all of Ukraine's hard-earned progress towards various freedoms, including religious freedom. If this transformation fails in Ukraine, I think hope will fade for peoples who have been unable to transform from communism towards religious freedom. As you well know, over 1.5 billion people in Russia, China, Belarus, and North Korea, for example. Conversely, if this transformation succeeds in Ukraine, I think these people will have a shining example of hope to follow. I think also at stake right now is the right of a sovereign nation to decide for itself whether to have religious freedom in its society. Ironically, the more progress Ukraine has made in recent decades away from the Soviet and Russian imperial models, the more Putin has seemingly wanted to invade Ukraine. I think he fears that Ukraine's example of relatively free society thriving with religious liberty and pluralism will inspire too many neighboring Russians to demand the same and overthrow his rule to build it for themselves. I'm afraid that Russian occupation would obliterate Ukraine's religious freedom. I think we already know that because of the vivid proof we've had from the regions Russia has already occupied since its invasion in 2014 of Crimea and the Donbass. Religious organizations have been destroyed or driven out, clergy murdered or imprisoned, religious buildings desecrated or damaged. And since February's invasion, lots of evidence has already emerged that Russian forces are repeating that devastation in new areas that Russia is occupying on a wider scale, including even damaging buildings of the Ukrainian branch of the Russian Orthodox Church that Russia claims to be invading to protect.
John, the part of what you just said was in the sense that religious freedom is a sort of weapon for peace. In other words, you've talked about how society in a transition, including an economy that bottomed out in the 90s, not just in Russia, but this happened in Ukraine as well. It's had political ups and downs, back and forth over the last 20 years. And yet it's had this dynamic religious marketplace, and that's been one of the building blocks. Could you say a little bit more about how religious freedom actually might help resist this attack and help shape Ukraine going forward?
I think it's a fascinating, underreported aspect of this generally, and I'm so glad that RFI is bringing attention to this as part of its larger mission for religious freedom. I think it's worth focusing on 3 specific areas in which religious liberty has contributed to Ukraine's resilience. Religious freedom and the pluralism that Ukraine has embraced has helped Ukrainians, I think, in these three ways. First, to revive a sense of higher national purpose. Second, to create resilient civil society organizations. And third, to connect internationally, especially by learning English and the use of social media. So back to that first one, the higher purpose. Religious freedom, as I have seen it, has been a central pillar in Ukraine's 3 decades of intentional nation building since it declared independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. I've seen a critical mass of Ukraine's post-Soviet generation choose a new purpose, right? To build a different society founded on Western values, government by the people, rule of law, individual rights, religious and other freedoms, a market-based economy, and human dignity. In diverse roles there across decades, as you mentioned, I have seen free Ukraine grow up. Now this founding generation of the largest democracy in 1,000 years of Slavic history has come of age. Second, to help them build the new civil society needed to fulfill that new purpose that Ukrainians have chosen, Ukraine has welcomed in over tens of thousands of experts and other volunteers from the free world, including thousands of religious workers of various faiths. I was one of them, as you mentioned, in the early years of the 1990s. And I witnessed how various religious organizations, finally free to flourish in Ukraine, not only disseminated teachings and beliefs, ministered to the needy, but also built what the Tsarist and Soviet systems did not, a framework of a civil society. Voluntary associations and leadership structures in which Ukrainians learn to trust, collaborate, and even lead in public, beyond the limits of their family circles to achieve shared goals. That's what was new in Ukraine. And religious organizations built it like no other. These burgeoning Ukrainian religious communities also gave Ukrainians extra motivation to connect online, especially via social media. I remember Ukrainians explaining to me the contrast to the state-controlled, top-down organization of Soviet life that they happily were leaving behind. Work, school, youth groups, sports unions, everything being decided by the government and run only by those that the government elected and approved. A decade later, I remember returning as an election observer for the 2004 presidential election do-over vote that followed the Orange Revolution. Again, I witnessed the central role of religious freedom in that victory over authoritarian abuse and corrupt elections. You may recall that the revolution's driving force were these massive peaceful protests that were on the front pages of newspapers in cities across the country. And the core of these protests, they were anchored by these tent cities of protesters who camped in the main square and refused to leave until their democratic demands were met. In Kiev, I remember the crowds reaching 1 million strong. How do you sustain such a movement, right? Like that throughout winter months that included weeks of sub-freezing temperatures? How do you handle the logistics alone, right? Organizing food and water and heat and sanitation and hygiene for a temporary city within a European capital. Religious organizations played an enormous role. I saw this, walked among the tent city to see how much it took, right, to sustain a movement like this. They played an enormous role behind the scenes handling logistics, but also visibly, including on the main stage of these protest rallies. There'd be leaders of various faiths extending across this stage, standing together night after night, leading the protesters in singing an ecumenical hymn, prayer for Ukraine. You want to have your spirits lifted? Stand among tens of thousands of people singing a prayer together for their nation's future and freedom. I noticed a remarkable number of children among these crowds, many small enough to sit atop their father's shoulders, despite the risks of winter and a police crackdown. I realized, why are they here? When I wondered why are they here, I realized their parents wanted the children to witness. They themselves had never seen what it looks like to stand fearless, to take control of your own people's destiny. Those kids who witnessed the Orange Revolution then are the generation of Ukrainians fighting the invaders today. Third thing, religious freedom in Ukraine also provided its population with unprecedented interaction and connection with foreigners and foreign languages. Forbidden during Soviet times, of course, to virtually everyone. Most foreigners entering Ukraine for religious activities did not speak the local language, and Soviet isolation meant, and I experienced this time and time again, many Ukrainians had never met a native speaker of a foreign language until they met me or my companions or fellow workers. So many faithful Ukrainians went to work to overcome that language barrier and studied language. Like many foreign missionaries, one form of community service that I performed in a number of cities that I served was to offer free English lessons regularly to eager Ukrainians. When religious workers typically return home from Ukraine, they often maintain connections, communications, and send back resources to help the communities and congregations that they have learned to love. So how have these three things manifested themselves in the resiliency for the invasion? To get back to your original question, first, right? Purpose. Ukraine's new purpose has helped to rally allies that see in Ukraine a reflection of their own aspirations and Western values. Ukraine's obvious tolerance and embrace of religious pluralism, including the Russian Orthodox Church's extensive presence in Ukraine, have exposed as a lie that its believers somehow need Putin's protection. Second, recent media has covered extensively how Ukrainian civil society generally, significantly fostered by religious organizations, has sustained the Ukrainian military and the nation's overall resilience. Religious organizations have also directly engaged in various ways that I think have been underreported, but I'm sure RFI and others will help to tell this story eventually. Right? Accounting for their members and neighbors after each night of bombing, ministering to the distraught, caring for the wounded and the orphaned, aiding those evacuating, aiding refugees, feeding those who stay at home, reuniting loved ones, sheltering those with destroyed homes, honoring and burying the dead, and comforting those who mourn. And third, the ability of so many Ukrainian leaders and citizens to speak English and foreign media outlets and to utilize social media has communicated convincingly, I think, to many the facts, the images, and the compelling stories of human harm and heroism. This web of international connections woven significantly by religious activity in Ukraine has provided a natural structure and strength for obtaining humanitarian aid, temporary shelter for refugees, and for rallying political and military support from foreign governments.
John, that's a very fascinating conception of how to think about civil society that you've given to us. So often we talk about civil society simply as just a few groups, and you've described, on the one hand, a very thick, vibrant society, humanitarians, professional clergy, lay people in the church, foreign groups coming in to help, and then the connections, school children who become the teens, who become the next generation, legal aid coming in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when I think about, as you use the term voluntary associations, terms used from Benjamin Franklin through de Tocqueville and others, one of the great strengths of a society that's going to be resilient, as you said, is one that has a robust civil society where there's flourishing freedom. But it's in part, that freedom is the freedom to organize, to help others, and to seek the common good. And the other thing that you mentioned so powerfully was, on the more philosophical side, is the way that religious freedom is the foundation, but intimately tied to other, what we in the US call first freedoms. It's religious freedom that is really the basis for conscience, for the right of free speech, as we recognize people created in God's image, and so a basis for political equality and human rights. It's religious people who need to be able to print, freedom of the press, to speak, but to listen as well. As you mentioned, these networks, it's not a one-way west to east or east to west. but this interchange of communication, and of course, the right to assemble, the right to private property, including even for a Russian-based Orthodox Church and a Ukraine-based, now coexisting for almost 5 years side by side. And so this is a very helpful, this kind of democratic lesson, in a sense, that you've given us about how Ukraine is very, very unique in the old Soviet bloc to be this way. So let me ask you, kind of wrapping up, what are a couple of the lessons you've learned inside Ukraine's religious dynamic from which others could learn as well?
Thanks for asking that, Eric. And I remember about 5 years ago attending an excellent conference that RFI put on or helped to sponsor in Washington, D.C. with some of these visionary Ukrainian leaders, religious leaders who were seeking this new way, right, of treating religion in a pluralistic and free way, and having civil society not competing but strengthened, right, by that religious interaction. Let me focus on one lesson that I think Ukraine has learned, that I've learned, that Ukraine has gained strength from, that I think other peoples striving to follow Ukraine's example and transformation can benefit from. Learn to adapt. And that can mean turning what may have seemed and may have really been national weaknesses in the past into national strengths. What am I talking about? Most of Ukraine's political history has been tragic. For a millennium, Ukraine has been surrounded by powerful empires, but has had few natural geographic barriers. Plundered for its rich human and natural resources repeatedly, and is being so as the Russian military is doing today. But modern Ukraine has learned to turn that history to its advantage through religious pluralism and a commitment to it. Ukraine has been invaded by Orthodox czars from Russia, by Catholic Poles, by Muslim Tartars and Turks, by Mongolians of Eastern religions. It still has a significant and growing Jewish population. It has substantial pluralism within Christianity in Ukraine, both new and traditional churches for that country. It even has pluralism within Orthodox Christianity, with at least 3 major branches in Ukraine alone. So Ukraine's history over centuries has assembled the ingredients for what could be religious pluralism, but only in recent decades, since the end of the Soviet period, has Ukraine embraced and tolerated multiple religions and enabled an environment of religious freedom. And that adaptation and openness to other religions is what I experienced even back as early as the 90s. I believe that is why religious life is so vibrant in Ukraine, much more than in Russia or any other large former communist country. I served in Ukraine and in Russia in the 1990s as a missionary, and naturally I came to care, right, about the people in both those countries. I still care about them. In that first decade after communism's collapse, I witnessed an initial gusher of openness, right, in both countries, including exchanges of difficult feedback between locals and their Western guests and counterparts. The discussion space in Russia and Ukraine diverged after Putin's rise. His regime gradually silenced unwelcome words, persons, and organizations, especially religious organizations, depriving Russia of quality current information. Meanwhile, Ukraine's messy democracy kept dialoguing through difficulty. Keeping it real enabled Ukraine to adjust to hard truths. I think those lessons that Ukraine has learned has held it in good stead now that it's in a conflict of historic proportions.
You know, you've made a really powerful claim about the basis for citizenship and how it ties to religious freedom. In Russia, Putin has spent the last 2 decades, and I believe he has a truly patriotic bent to him in a certain way of trying to rebuild a Russia broken at the end of the Soviet period. But he's been doing it in an exclusivist, chauvinistic way. It's us versus them. It's my way, no other way. And it's a very narrow view that bullies others to demonstrate some sort of strength of that narrow in-group, this Russian Orthodox nationalist vision. What a difference between that and the Ukrainian approach, and some other countries. I would say Poland has some of this, et cetera. But this view that we can have Ukrainian national churches, but just not one. And we don't need our political leaders to tell us what our faith tradition is, although they shouldn't mock our faith traditions. And that our religious leaders can say, I disagree with your theology, and yet I believe in your right to express it here. And moreover, I'm going to stand shoulder to shoulder with you against oppression. And so this notion of a shared citizenship, that where there can be differentials of faith tradition and faith belief, that can be fundamental differences, but that they need not be the things that divide a country in terms of its aspirations for democracy, for democratic legitimacy, and ultimately for societal success. I mean, what a difference that you've drawn. John, let me ask you, have we missed anything today? What would you like to add?
Yeah, well, we've covered, I think, some important ground. And I'm glad you're doing this series. In wrapping up here, I wouldn't want us to miss the big picture, right? The big picture of what's happening in Ukraine. I've spent a lifetime, as you mentioned, for personal and other reasons, right? Paying attention to what is happening in this country. And the big picture is that Ukrainians have shown in 3 months what a free people can do in a righteous cause. Now the whole world, right, has seen daily the bravery, virtue, spirit, teamwork, and love of liberty that have long characterized the Ukrainian people. They have been capably and calmly countering terror and tragedy in a barbaric invasion. And by doing so, paradoxically, I think they have produced Ukraine's finest hour. You know, Ukraine's current leader has been compared to Winston Churchill, and Churchill's phrase, of course, was talking about how Britain's finest hour in resisting the evil assault on it. Now, in a matter of weeks, Ukraine has halted an invasion of Europe by Europe's largest army, dispelled European self-doubt about the worth of its traditional and religious values, revived NATO's purpose, and rallied the free world to take sides openly in a fight between good and evil. Not bad for a nation that Putin long publicly derided and denigrated as not a real country. I think Ukraine's unprecedented importance on the world stage today is really a moment in a long arc of yearning for and fighting for freedom in Ukraine. To end on a personal note, right? My most vivid memories as a child include listening to my grandparents describe the brutality of Soviet occupation during World War II and their epic escape from that to the free West. The first time I ever saw a future president, I saw candidate Ronald Reagan speaking to Americans of Ukrainian descent at a heritage festival in New Jersey, promising to oppose the evils of communism and work to free the captive people of Ukraine. It seemed like such a distant dream at the time. The first political rally I can recall participating in as a youth was in our nation's capital in 1988. It was the 1,000-year anniversary of the official adoption of Christianity in Ukraine. And I can remember us marching to the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. and holding signs and demanding free our churches in Ukraine. For 3 decades, Ukraine's churches have been free. And now they are facing the most serious threat since the Soviet Union to that freedom. I guess I'd close in the big picture in saying, once Putin runs out of bombs and bullets to destroy what he cannot control, Ukrainians will need the free world and its generosity to rebuild. Money, volunteers, and expertise can rebuild the homes, schools, churches, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure that Russia has intentionally destroyed and continues to destroy, even as its prospects of ultimate victory evaporate. Religious organizations will be central to that rebuilding. A spirit of religious freedom and a tolerance for others that all have a future in Ukraine's rebuilt new civil society, right, will be essential, right, to what is going to be Ukraine's most significant task of rebuilding in the modern era. I appreciate your conversation today, Eric, very much.
John, thank you for that and for those closing remarks, which remind us about how often it has been people of faith at the front lines rallying for freedom. Think about Pope John Paul II in Poland in the 1970s and 80s and his important witness really on a global scale. I think about the faith inspiration that Ronald Reagan had in his understanding of what was evil. I think about churches in places like Hong Kong and China today, I think, who are inspired by what they're seeing, the possibilities that they're seeing in Ukraine. And the list goes on and on and on. And so you've reminded us that Ukraine is not just a local concern, but it is one that the entire world is watching. John, again, thank you on behalf of all of us at RFI for this fascinating talk, this insight into how to better understand the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the religious dynamics on the ground there. Thank you very much.